The sun hung low over Willow Creek, Georgia, casting an orange haze across the county fairgrounds, where dust clung to Amos Jackson's worn boots like a second skin. At 52, Amos stood at the edge of the crowd, his broad shoulders hunched. Under the weight of years of labor, loss, and a town that respected him but never quite let him forget he was a black man in a world that often looked the other way. His hands, rough as tree bark from hauling lumber and mending fences, twisted the brim of his faded hat. The air buzzed with murmurs, but Amos's gaze was locked on the makeshift stage ahead, where a scene unfolded that clawed at his soul. A girl, barely 19, stood trembling, her dark hair falling in tangled waves over a threadbare dress. Her name, whispered among the crowd, was Lila. Her parents, faces carved with desperation and greed, were auctioning her off to settle their debts. Amos, a widower with a rundown cabin and a heart still raw from burying his wife, Clara, felt a fire ignite in his chest, a fire that burned hotter with every second he stood there, powerless. He had no money, no plan, but one truth screamed louder than his doubts. He couldn't let this happen. Amos knew pain like an old friend. 5 years ago, he'd lost Clara to cancer, her laughter snuffed out like a candle in a storm. They'd dreamed of children, of a home filled with noise and love, but life had other plans. Now he lived alone on the outskirts of town, scraping by on odd jobs, his savings devoured by hospital bills. The townsfolk called him Steady Amos, a man who'd earned his place through grit, but pity lingered in their eyes. He was a man who'd fought for dignity in a world that rarely offered it freely. As he watched Lila, her hands clasped tight to hide their shaking, something broke inside him. He'd seen cruelty. Men cheated out of wages, families pushed off, their land. But this was different. This was a girl, barely grown, being sold like livestock by the very people meant to protect her. The crowd's whispers grew louder, some shocked, others curious, but none stepped forward. Amos's heart pounded, each beat a drum of rage and resolve. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a voice like gravel, bellowed, "Who'll start at 500?" Lila's eyes, wide and glistening, darted across the crowd, searching for salvation. Her parents stood to the side, her father's jaw set, her mother's face a mask of shame she couldn't quite hide. A man in a sweat-stained shirt raised his hand. 550, another voice, sharp and greedy, called. 600. The bids climbed, each one a knife twisting in Amos's gut. He had $20 in his pocket, a rusted truck that coughed more than it ran, and a cabin that leaked when it rained. He was nobody's hero, not anymore. Yet, Clara's voice echoed in his mind, soft but unyielding. "Do what's right, Amos, even when it's impossible." His hand shot up before he could stop it. "I'll take her," he shouted, his deep voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Heads turned, eyes wide with disbelief. The auctioneer squinted, his lip curling. "You got the cash, Jackson?" Amos's throat tightened. He didn't. He knew it. The crowd knew it. And the auctioneer's sneer said he knew it too. "I'll find a way," Amos said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his knees. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some mocking, others curious. Lila's gaze locked onto his, her eyes a storm of fear and fragile hope. She didn't know him, but in that moment, Amos felt her trust, heavy as a stone. The auctioneer laughed, sharp and cruel. "This ain't a game, old man. Cash or step aside." Another bid rang out, 700, then 8. Amos's heart sank, but he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when Lila's future hung by a thread. Then, like a spark in dry grass, an idea hit him. Reckless, absurd, but undeniable. He pushed through the crowd, his boots crunching on gravel, and climbed onto the stage. The murmurs hushed, every eye on him. "Stop this!" he roared, his voice shaking with conviction. "I ain't got money, but I got my hands, my back, my will. I'll work off her debt. Whatever they owe, I'll pay it in labor, sun up to sundown, till it's done." The silence that followed was deafening. Lila's parents exchanged glances, their greed warring with unease. The auctioneer's jaw dropped, then snapped shut. "You're out of your mind, Amos. That debt's thousands. You'll die before you clear it." Amos didn't flinch. "Try me," he said, his eyes burning into Lila's father. Something in his stare, raw, unyielding, made the man falter. The crowd buzzed again, whispers turning to arguments. "He's crazy," one man muttered. "He's a fool," said another. But a woman in the back, her voice soft, said, "He's a good man." Lila's father stepped forward, his face a mix of spite and calculation. "Fine," he spat. "You work my fields for a year. Every day, no excuses. You fail, she's back here, and you get nothing." Amos nodded, though his body screamed at the weight of the promise. A year of back-breaking labor for a stranger, with no guarantee he'd survive it. Yet, as Lila stepped down from the stage, her small frame trembling, she whispered, "Why?" Amos met her eyes, his voice low. "Because no one deserves this." He took her to his cabin, a sagging structure with peeling paint and a porch that creaked underfoot. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and thyme, with Clara's old quilt draped over a chair and her sewing machine gathering dust in the corner. Lila stood in the doorway, clutching her arms, her eyes darting like a deer ready to bolt. Amos didn't push her. "You're free to go," he said, setting a plate of cornbread and beans on the table. "I ain't your keeper, but you're safe here." She didn't speak, just sat, her movements careful, as if waiting for a trap. Over the next few days, Amos learned fragments of her story. Lila had been a straight-A student, dreaming of college, but her parents' gambling debts had swallowed her future. They'd sold her clothes, her books, and now her freedom. Amos listened, his heart heavy, and offered her the spare room where Clara's things still lingered like ghosts. Lila stayed, not out of obligation, but because Amos's quiet kindness felt like a lifeline. She began helping with chores, chopping wood, tending the small garden behind the cabin, her hands learning the rhythm of survival. At night, they sat on the porch, the Georgia stars bright above the pines, and Amos shared stories of Clara, her love for gospel music, her stubborn hope, her belief that one good act could ripple through the world. Lila listened, her silence softening. And one night she spoke. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To help kids like me, kids no one sees." Amos nodded, his throat tight. He saw Clara in her, that same quiet fire, and it stirred, something he thought he'd lost, but the work was relentless. Lila's father, true to his word, demanded Amos's labor on his sprawling farm. Each morning, Amos rose before dawn, his body protesting as he hauled hay, mended fences, and plowed fields under a sun that felt like a hammer. His hands blistered, his back ached, and some nights he collapsed on his cot, too exhausted to eat. Lila watched, guilt etching lines on her young face. One evening, as she wrapped his hands in torn strips of cloth, she said, "You're killing yourself for me. I'm not worth it." Amos's eyes flashed, fierce and unwavering. "Don't you ever say that. You're worth more than they'll ever know." She looked away, tears brimming, and Amos wondered if she believed him. The town began to notice. Whispers of Amos's sacrifice spread, carried on the wind like seeds. A grocer slipped extra cans of soup into his bag. A mechanic tinkered with his truck refusing payment. Small acts, but they fueled Amos's resolve. Yet danger loomed. One stormy night, Lila's father pounded on the cabin door, his voice slurred with whiskey. "You're slacking, old man," he bellowed. "I'll drag her back to that stage." Lila froze, her face pale as moonlight, but Amos stood tall, his frame filling the doorway. "You'll have to kill me first," he said, his voice a low growl. The man cursed and stumbled away, but Amos knew this was only a pause, not an end. The next morning, Lila was gone. A note lay on the kitchen table, scrawled in hurried ink. "I can't let you break for me. I'm finding my own way." Amos's heart stopped. He searched the town, his voice hoarse from calling her name. Had she run back to her parents? Had she fled Willow Creek entirely? Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The work continued, but without Lila's quiet presence, Amos felt hollow, like a man shoveling dirt into his own grave. He wondered if he'd failed her, if his sacrifice had been a fool's errand. Yet, deep down, a spark of hope flickered, a hope that Lila, like Clara, was stronger than the world that tried to break her. The days after Lila's disappearance stretched like an endless wound for Amos Jackson. His small cabin, once warmed by her quiet presence, felt hollow. The creak of its floorboards a mocking echo of his failure. Each morning he dragged himself to her father's farm, his body screaming under the weight of bales and the unrelenting Georgia sun. His hands, now cracked and bleeding, gripped the plow with a stubbornness that defied his fading strength. The townsfolk of Willow Creek whispered about him, some with pity, others with awe, but none could fill the void Lila left. Amos's heart churned with questions. Where had she gone? Had she run back to the parents who'd betrayed her, or had she vanished into a world too big and cruel for a girl with nothing but dreams? At night, he sat on his porch, staring at the stars, Clara's old quilt draped over his shoulders. Her voice haunted him. "Keep going, Amos, even when it hurts." But for the first time since her death, he wasn't sure he could. The work was a beast that never slept. Lila's father, a man whose greed seemed to grow with every passing day, pushed Amos harder, his taunts sharp as barbed wire. "You thought you could play hero?" he sneered one afternoon, tossing a rusted shovel at Amos's feet. "She's gone, and you're still mine." Amos didn't answer, just kept digging, his jaw tight. He'd made a vow not to this man, but to Lila, to give her a chance, even if it broke him. Yet, doubt gnawed at him. Had she seen his sacrifice as a chain, not a lifeline? The thought stung worse than the blisters on his palms. He worked through sunrises and storms, his body a machine fueled by memory and grit, but his spirit wavered. The townsfolk noticed his hunched frame, the way his eyes no longer met theirs. "He's fading," they whispered at the diner, their voices heavy with guilt for staying silent that day at the auction. But Willow Creek was changing, stirred by the ripples of Amos's stand. The grocer, a gruff man named Eli, began leaving. Bags of apples and canned beans at Amos's door. No note, no explanation. The mechanic, Sarah, who'd fixed his truck months ago, stopped by to tune it again, her hands black with grease as she waved off his thanks. "You're doing what we couldn't," she muttered, her eyes avoiding his. These small kindnesses were lifelines, fragile but real, and they kept Amos moving, Schwangau system. Moving. He poured his energy into the plow, his muscles burning, but his mind was elsewhere, on Lila, on the note she'd left, on the promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The town's gestures, though generous, couldn't fill the hole her absence left. He began to wonder if he'd misread her, if his act of defiance had pushed her away instead of setting her free. Weeks bled into months, and the harvest season loomed, the air thick with the scent of ripe peaches and impending change. Amos's body was a map of pain, his back stooped, his hands gnarled, but he refused to break. Clara's memory held him together, her voice a whisper in the wind. You're stronger than you know. Still, the weight of Lila's absence pressed harder than the work. He searched for her in every passing face, in every shadow, but found only questions. Had she made it to a city, chasing her dream of teaching? Or had her parents found her, dragging her back to their world of debts and despair? The uncertainty was a blade, twisting deeper each day. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, everything changed. Amos was hauling firewood when he heard footsteps on the gravel path. He turned, his breath catching. There stood Lila, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes brighter than he'd ever seen them. She wore a clean dress, simple but new, and carried a small bag slung over her shoulder. For a moment, Amos thought he was dreaming, his exhausted mind playing tricks. But her voice, soft yet steady, broke the spell. "I'm back," she said, her lips trembling with a smile. Amos dropped the wood, his heart thundering. "Lila," he whispered, his voice cracking. She stepped forward, hesitating, then threw her arms around him. The embrace was brief but fierce, and Amos felt the world shift beneath his feet. "Where'd you go?" he asked, pulling back to study her face. Her eyes, once haunted, now burned with purpose. "Atlanta," she said. "I couldn't let you destroy yourself for me. I found a lawyer, a good one, pro bono. He's helping me sue my parents for what they did, and I got a job at a diner saving for college." Amos's chest tightened, pride and relief warring within him. "You didn't have to come back," he said, his voice thick. Lila's smile widened, a real smile, the kind that lit up the morning. "I wanted to. You gave me a chance, Amos. I'm taking it now." The news spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. Lila's return was a spark, igniting something long dormant in the town. At the Harvest Festival, the air buzzed with anticipation as Lila insisted on speaking. Amos sat in the front row, his hands trembling, unsure what to expect. Lila took the stage, her voice clear and strong. "This man," she said, pointing to Amos, "saw me when no one else did. He risked everything, his health, his home, his heart, for a stranger. He showed me what it means to be human." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice never wavered. "I'm standing here because of him, and I'll spend my life paying that forward." The crowd erupted, clapping, crying, some standing in ovation. Amos's eyes burned, and he felt Clara's presence, warm and close, as if she were there, clapping too. Lila's words were a turning point. The town, once divided by gossip and fear, rallied around them. Farmers offered Amos tools and supplies. Shopkeepers sent meals. Lila, now enrolled in community college, began mentoring kids at the youth center, her dream of teaching taking root. Amos, his year of labor complete, joined her, sharing stories of Clara to inspire the children. Together, they built something new, a community center where kids like Lila could dream without fear. The cabin, once a shell of memories, became a hub of laughter and hope, filled with voices and plans for the future. One evening, as fireflies danced under the Georgia pines, Amos and Lila sat on the porch, the stars bright above. "You changed my life," Lila said, her voice soft but sure. Amos chuckled, his eyes crinkling. "No, girl, you changed mine." He looked out at the night, feeling Clara's smile in the breeze. Their story spread beyond Willow Creek, carried by travelers and news, a testament to the power of one man's heart. In a world often shadowed by cruelty, Amos's sacrifice and Lila's resilience proved that kindness could spark a revolution, lighting up even the darkest corners with hope.